All right, so when you hear the phrase the 1920s, your mind probably jumps straight to, flappers in those sequin dresses, jazz bands playing in smoky speakeasies, maybe pristine Ford Model Ts rolling down newly paved streets. It's the Roaring Twenties, right? This era of just endless prosperity, magic, and unprecedented wealth. Well, today, in this explainer, we're going to completely shatter that illusion. Because for the millions of everyday Americans who actually built that world, the 1920s didn't roar at all.
Listen to this quote from President Herbert Hoover in 1928. He said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." I mean, wow, it perfectly captures this sheer, almost blinding optimism of the era's public perception. And honestly, if you were just looking at the gross domestic product or watching the soaring stock market, you might actually believe poverty was about to be eradicated forever.
Okay, let's dive into this. Who was actually roaring? Because, let me tell you, it certainly wasn't everyone. Today, we need to look past those velvet ropes at the nightclubs and past the soaring profits of Wall Street. We're going to look at this iconic decade through the grease-stained boots of an ordinary factory worker. You know what's fascinating? The people actually living through this era, they didn't even call it the Roaring Twenties. That was a term coined after the fact, mostly after the Great Depression, looking back with a pretty heavy dose of nostalgia. For the working class, all that glitz and glamour you see in the movies was entirely an illusion. For them, this decade wasn't a giant party. It was a daily, grinding struggle for pure survival in an economic system that demanded absolutely everything they had. So, let's just step into their shoes for a typical day. Picture this. It's 6:15 a.m. You push through the glass door of a corner diner. The air is thick with the smell of frying bacon and the machine oil coming off the jackets of the other workers. You grab a 10-cent bottomless black coffee, swallow down your eggs fast because at 7 a.m. sharp, your shift starts. You're heading into a deafening, incredibly dangerous assembly line where you're going to perform the exact same repetitive motion for 10 straight hours. And when the sun finally goes down, you don't head to a cabaret. You drag your exhausted body back to a subdivided, drafty, cold water flat where the walls are basically just a suggestion and the radiator knocks all night long.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the hard macroeconomic data strictly backs up that gritty reality. During this supposed era of universal prosperity, there was a staggering wealth gap. Just look at this distribution. The top 10% of the population managed to capture a massive 40% of the nation's total income. So yeah, the wealth was piling up for sure, but it was heavily concentrated at the very top, leaving the remaining 90% of the country to fight over the scraps.
And that leads us to this sharp, honestly jarring statistic, 40%. Despite the booming national GDP, and despite those stunning Art Deco skyscrapers going up in New York and Chicago, an estimated 40% of all Americans lived in actual grinding poverty during this decade. Who were they? Well, they were rural sharecroppers in the South whose crop prices completely collapsed after World War I. They were Appalachian coal miners. And of course, they were the urban factory workers churning out the very consumer goods that defined the decade. The roar of the 20s was literally silent for nearly half the country. The working class was trapped in a brutal financial squeeze. Average worker wages remained stubbornly flat throughout the entire decade, while urban rent prices absolutely skyrocketed. As millions migrated to the cities seeking work, especially during the Great Migration, where hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved north seeking better opportunities and escaping Jim Crow, landlords ruthlessly capitalized on the limited housing supply. In places like Harlem, tenants were paying rents up to 50% higher than people living in comparable white neighborhoods, all while earning significantly less. Let's break down the impossible math of a worker's life back then. Imagine you're a domestic worker or a factory laborer earning maybe $7 or $8 a week. Right off the top, $5 or $6 goes immediately to your landlord just to keep a basic roof over your head. That leaves you with what? Maybe $2? $2 to feed, clothe, and care for your entire family for a whole week. One single medical emergency, one missed shift because you caught a fever, or just one harsh winter where your kids needed new coats could mean total financial ruin.
So how did they survive? Well, they leaned heavily on community, which birthed the absolutely brilliant social institution of the rent party. Think about it. You're short on rent, so what do? You hire a piano player, maybe a future jazz legend playing thunderous stride piano. You push all your shabby furniture against the walls, and you charge your neighbors a 10-cent admission to come dance in your living room until the sun comes up. It was a beautiful, resourceful, and honestly quite fun response to predatory economics. The working class used joy, music, and sheer communal survival to bridge the gap that their flat wages simply couldn't cover.
But it's a profound, kind of tragic irony, isn't it?
These everyday workers were literally the muscle building the modern world. They were the ones stringing up the precarious electrical wires that lit up the growing cities. They were pouring the blazing hot steel for those famous skyscrapers and sweating on the line to churn out a new Ford Model T every 10 seconds. Yet they could barely afford to survive in the very world they were constructing with their own hands.
So you might be wondering, how was the illusion of widespread wealth maintained despite flat wages and declining union power? The answer is a groundbreaking and highly dangerous financial invention: consumer credit. The buy now, pay later installment plan was born, and this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide between actual accumulated wealth and artificial credit wealth. The entire facade of middle-class prosperity was suddenly masking a severe lack of actual savings.
This credit illusion is what truly subsidized the Roaring Twenties. By 1926, a staggering 75% of all new cars were bought on credit. But it went far beyond cars. People were artificially financing everything from sewing machines to vacuum cleaners to the brand new household radio, all on installment plans. We take this completely for granted today, but at the time, the idea of going into debt for a household appliance was a radical, almost absurd cultural shift. Historically, debt was considered shameful. But because wages simply weren't rising, the only way ordinary Americans could participate in the promised consumer boom was to borrow against their future. Consequently, consumer debt completely doubled over the course of a single decade.
When you pull all these threads together, a very clear picture emerges. The economic boom of the 1920s was fundamentally hollow at its core. It wasn't built on a sturdy foundation of equitable wealth distribution or a thriving, economically secure middle class. No, it was subsidized directly by the exhausted, underpaid labor of the working class, and it was propped up by an absolutely massive mountain of precarious consumer debt.
So, the crucial point is this. The working class built the Roaring Twenties on their backs, paying for it with their debt, their labor, and their silence. All that glitz, the glamour, the endless glittering Gatsby parties, none of it exists without the factory worker at 6:15 a.m. drinking a 10-cent coffee, preparing to give another 10 hours of their life to a machine just to barely make rent.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering thought. If the entire roar of this legendary decade was just an illusion, a fragile house of cards built on massive, unsustainable debt and exploited labor, how long could it actually last before gravity took hold? When you look at the 1920s through the eyes of the factory worker, the catastrophic crash of 1929 doesn't look like a sudden surprise at all. It looks like an inevitable tragedy. I really hope this explainer has completely changed how you view the Jazz Age. Keep asking questions and keep looking past the glitter.